All right, hi, and welcome back to the 7th week of the Epidemics MOOC and our AUA session for this week. This week we've been focusing explicitly on emergence and evolutionary pathways, but we also have been talking about mechanisms of control following on some of the discussion from last week. And this week, the guest that we have along is Matt Thomas, who works in the entomology department here at Penn State, who has a lot of experience, particularly in vector-borne diseases and control of vectors.
Yeah, so my interest is in insect pests, and historically that was a lot of work in agriculture. Basically trying to understand what makes a pest a pest. Not all insects are pests, but then some become pests. And then what are we going to do about it? How are we going to control them? And then in the last few years, the pests I've become increasingly interested in are mosquitoes, and particularly those that transmit diseases like malaria and dengue. So the work in our lab tries to understand, again, why are certain pests more problematic than others? Why is there more malaria in one place than another place? How might that change in the future? And what can we do about it? What are the new tools that we might be able to develop to try and combat these diseases?
Well, and so where last week and this week converge is in the how control for pests, whether they're vectors or insect pests or pathogens themselves, can respond and cause selective pressures, right? We've talked quite a bit about evolution of resistance and evolution of virulence in this week's lectures. So I wanted to pose, what can we learn about the experience with resistance evolution in vectors or in insects in general, and how well does that translate to how we might develop controls for resistance evolution or management of resistance evolution in pathogens themselves?
So I think with vectors, if you look at the history of insect control, and if you look at agriculture in the first place and how that's now sort of extend those lessons into public health. And one thing we know is that if you try and hit something hard with some lethal agent, a biocide, and you use a sort of single magic bullet approach, then you're going to get evolution as a response. And if you look at, there was talk back in the 1940s and 50s with the advent of modern chemistry, there was discussion around pest-free agriculture. This was, people have been living with pests for years, intensifying agriculture, leading to new pest insects. And then the advent of DDT and organophosphates and other organochlorides created this prospect that we could actually get rid of pests. Mm-hmm. And 10 or 15 years of trying, increasingly ratcheting up more insecticides, basically creating some sort of insecticide treadmill, left everybody to realize actually we can't do that, because what we're going to see is we'll apply insecticide, we'll evoke resistance, we'll apply more insecticides, we'll get more resistance, either stronger resistance or resistance to another compound. And that basically led to, it was one of the main drivers, that and concerns around the environmental contamination. So there were two drivers. Evolution of resistance, concern around environmental contamination, and the likes of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, led to the development of integrated pest management. The idea to use insecticides judiciously, still a key part of the toolbox, but only one tool, and to use a suite of other tools with which you could try and combat diseases. And rather than focus on eradication, it went away, it was a sort of transition from pest eradication to pest management. How can we manage these things at levels that we can live with? Mm-hmm. And
there seems there's also an important difference there, right? In an agricultural setting, right, there's an economic trade-off, and we can live with a certain amount of loss. But in public health, many of us don't want to live with any disease.
Yeah, so that is one of the differences. I mean, there are some clear parallels in how the use of sort of interventions, particularly insecticide-based interventions, and those are still the frontline technologies against mosquito vectors like malaria vectors and dengue vectors, still reliant on, in fact, the very same products. A lot of the products are even taken from agriculture. There is no new public health insecticides. They all come from agriculture. There are only 4 classes of insecticides approved for use in public health. They all come from agriculture. And there hasn't been a new one for the last 20 years, 20, 30 years. So it's still very much based on using insecticides high doses and trying to eliminate or eradicate the disease. And I think it creates an interesting tension as to whether, in fact, we should be looking at management and how we manage the issues, public health and perhaps ethical issues of maintaining a disease at a low level, reducing disease burden, reducing mortality and morbidity, but maintaining that potentially at a low sustainable level, rather than shooting for some goal of eradication. And what comes with eradication may be increased cost, increased challenges, diversion of funds away from something that we know that works and can keep things at a low level towards trying to go for something which perhaps is more aspirational than realistic. I mean, it's very hard. I'm not saying that we shouldn't go for malaria eradication. Clearly, that's a good thing. Who would argue against that? And we have tools. We've shown that we can do that in various places. There's no malaria in the US. There used to be. There's no malaria in Italy. There used to be. There's no malaria in Australia. There used to be. So we can do eradication. Trying to do that in settings like parts of tropical Africa with much more challenging infrastructure is really what makes it very, very difficult. And I think some of the difficulties I think there is a tension between, do we shoot for eradication? Do we have the tools available to do that? How much do we invest in creating those tools such that we can achieve that goal perhaps 30 years down the line, rather than taking it down to a minimum level now?
And one of the very interesting concepts that's come out of integrated pest management is the use of management strategies that will prolong the useful life of existing technologies, right? So that we can prevent things from rebounding in the future as a consequence of resistance evolution, or buy us some time perhaps to develop something a slightly more silver bullet, right? Or something with at least a little bit more sheen on it.
If we gave you a limitless budget, no, it can't be limitless, can it? That's not possible. But if we gave you a huge budget and asked you to eradicate malaria from Africa, could you do it?
On a time frame of what?
10 years?
10 years. That would need to be quite a big budget.
So it is.
So yeah, no, I think we could eradicate from. With the current tools, I think we still might need new tools. But I think there are areas where we could absolutely eradicate it, and there are areas where we could drive it down to very, very low levels. One of the challenges in eradication is if you do it locally, and you have this island where you've eradicated it, and you're surrounded by this intense area where there's still lots of malaria, you've constantly got this spillover, this infill, and it's very, very difficult.
And that's the mosquitoes. That's not people moving in.
No, it would be both people, particularly. But if you don't. I mean, you can get rid of the disease, but if you still have a conducive environment, you still have the vectors in place. And that's what we have in the US, right? So we've got no malaria, but there are still vectors here. People come into the US. We have about 1,000 cases or so, something like that, in the US each year of imported malaria. Very, very occasionally we get this small stuttering chains of somebody brings it into an airport, they get bitten, and it carries on, but then it peters out because we have basically R naught below 1. So trying to do that, you could create islands like that, and you could shrink the malaria map, I think, in parts of Africa. It creates a tension between where's the biggest disease burden, and should you be better off reducing disease burden by 90% where there's a lot of disease, or using those resources to try and shrink the map where there's actually rather less disease, but your focus is on eradication. And that's a tension. Andrew and I have a project in India, and that was a real tension actually for the National Institute of Malaria Research. Is what's their position on eradication? Well, it's very difficult because you've got areas where we can reduce the burden of disease, or we can focus on eradication, but we don't actually have resources to try and do both.
Interesting.